Okay, welcome. Today I'm going to be giving a brief overview of question words, or as you're going to see, palabras interrogativos. This means interrogatives, and it's a fancy way of saying basically how do we form questions. So I want to show two things to begin with, and then I'm going to give you the words. So number one, the good news is that Spanish has a much simpler way to form questions. The bad news is that we are going to have to kind of forget some of the English logic, excuse me, about how we form these words or these questions. So let's start. And so there are many different ways to ask questions. And one thing that's similar to both English and Spanish is intonation. So, intonation is where we put the stress um, on a whole sentence. And in this case, I'd like you to see something. So, I have two words here dinner. Now, one, I'm going to say it flat. So, please listen dinner. So, as you can see, that straight line indicates that with a statement, we have just a flat line. So, dinner doesn't change. However, if you were asking someone if they wanted to go to dinner, you might just say, dinner? And as you can see, if you hear when you ask a question, how are you? How are you? All these have a rising intonation. So, towards the end, you're going to hear the emphasis. So next, here is something that is really hard for students to drop from how they think about answering questions. So do and does not exist in Spanish. Actually, fun fact you will never use do and does when we use it to form questions and answer questions, not the word for to do, like to do the dishes. That's completely different. But do and does in questions and responses only exists in ancient Irish or ancient Celtic and English. So English is the language that survived and kept it. Now, in that case, just drop it. So as you can see here in the example, does Paco study? We're just going to use the word estudia. Estudia Paco. And as you can hear, that rising intonation. Now, here's another thing that we share between Spanish and English. So the interrogative is going to mean that we are going to switch the verb and the subject. So, be it a pronoun or another noun. So, as you can see here in English and Spanish, we have I listen or yo escucho. However, if we want to say this in Spanish and we're going to make it a question, as you can see, do is going to be our first verb. So, we have do I listen. However, in Spanish, we are going to put escucho yo. Another thing is think about when we say, how are you? In a regular statement, it would be you are. However, in the question, how are you? It's going to be, excuse me, ¿cómo estás tú? Or even people will also drop the two because we know that you are is in estás because of the S. So you could say ¿Cómo estás? ¿Cómo estás tú? Or you can completely form one question based off of the verb. So as you can hear, ¿hablas español? Do you speak Spanish? So here are the question words, and I gave these to students. Also, I want them to pay particular attention to the accent mark. And I'll explain why on the next slide, but this is what makes it a question. And another thing to note is that, as you can see, we put an upside down question mark at the beginning. Fun story, we were actually thinking of doing that within the English language for rhetorical questions, but we did not. So, as you can see here, number one, por qué is why, cuando is when, qué is what, donde is where, cuánto or cuántas, is how many. Como, quién is who. Which and is cuál or cuáles. And one of my favorite verbs is I. So I is irregular, but it's the best type of irregular. We do not need to conjugate it. So if you need to say I farmacia, so or I banco, is there a pharmacy or is there a is there a bank? So just by saying I, we are saying is there or are there. So think about the fact that we could be asking about two or more things in English, and we're going to need to say, are there banks? But in Spanish, we just have I, so hay bancos. So that's a great word to know. And as you can see in questions, we're going to use it a lot. Now, as I mentioned below, where you see, for example, cuantos, quiénes, or cuáles, this is when we are going to be talking about a subject that is plural. So if I wanted to ask about how much are the potatoes instead of just one potato, I would say, ¿Cuántos son las papas? All right. Or um, which are the numbers? I would say, ¿Cuáles son los números? Now, here's the next thing I wanted to mention, as I mentioned there. All right. All of these question words, except I, have an accent. And if you do not put an accent, it's actually going to change. So if you think about, take a look down here. Um, the house where Jake lives is pretty. So as you can see, Donde doesn't have an accent. So we use the house where Jake lives. Jake is the student who has good grades. We could also say when we use the word porque, which means why. When it's one word and it doesn't have an accent, why becomes because. And cuando, we can use that as well to mean when. So I'll figure out a time when we can meet. So this is a lot. We're going to review it over with students, but as they are starting to work, they're going to get um, to be able to deal with a lot more sophisticated sentences. So in the future, we will work with this. Students received a worksheet, and here's one example. So, ¿Cómo está Ricardo? So, how is he doing right now? Or, how is Richard? What is his personality? So, we're going to get into Sarah and Estar a little bit later. But as you can see, students should, with their Spanish right now, be able to at least identify the question words and maybe start to pick apart with context clues what they are talking about. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope this helps. Please give me feedback.